So today's video is all about not only the transatlantic slave trade, but also the effects that this is going to have on Africa. Because often the slave trade and plantation, chattel slavery is viewed within the context of the Western Hemisphere without much thought given to what happened back in Africa. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at here today. Now bear in mind, when we look at this process, yes, slavery has essentially been present ever since humans have started forming into societies and eventually settled communities. It especially took off in civilizations where warfare and capture were common, and it becomes accepted practice. Now Africans had practiced slavery and they had sold slaves for centuries, and the trans-Saharan trade took slaves to the Mediterranean world. The East African slave trade had been present since the 7th century, and the Islamic slave trade resulted in many Africans living outside of the continent. So this is a practice that has been present. It's just going to be taken to a completely new level in the Western Hemisphere. Now, slavery does take many forms depending on, the region and the time period. Indian Ocean slaves. So slaves within the Indian Ocean basin often become part of their owners' households. And, the children of slaves sometimes were free, sometimes they were slaves. The Islamic world preferred female slaves and slaves for more domestic work. Whereas when we look at the Americas, the preference is for male slaves for plantation work. So historically, different roles were given depending on the region. Now, the scale and importance of the slave trade in the Americas was enormous, and it's largely based on plantation agriculture, with slaves really being denied any rights at all. The status of the slaves was inherited. There was pretty much no hope of manumission, and the unfortunate irony is that you have slavery present in societies that claim to value human freedom and equality. Now, many of the origins of Atlantic slavery lay in the Mediterranean and with sugar production. Europeans had to sweeten food with honey and fruits up until the Crusades. And after the Crusades, Europeans were hooked on sugar, and they learned from Arabs how to set up large plantations. The first plantations were set up in the Mediterranean, then on the coast of West Africa, and eventually on islands that are just west of Africa. Now, sugar production is really the first modern industry where you had major capital investment, different technologies, disciplined workers, and a mass market. And this is dangerous and difficult work. Slaves were viewed as ideal, and at first, Slavs were used. Slavs from the Black region provided slaves for Mediterranean sugar plantations. The Portuguese ended up finding an alternative slave source in West Africa. Now, the supply of Slavs fell, it really dropped off when Constantinople fell. So Europeans used their links to West Africa to provide labor for sugar and eventually tobacco and cotton plantations. In 1452, the Pope even granted full and free permission to invade, search, capture, and subjugate the Muslims and pagans and any other unbelievers, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. So there's religious justification for this. Now, in the Americas, Africans do become the primary source of coerced or coercive labor. Native Americans died off from European diseases, and they also knew the terrain, so they could easily escape. Europeans were considered a bad alternative. Christians from marginal lands couldn't be enslaved. Indentured servants were expensive. But Africans were farmers. They understood how to work the land, and they had some immunity to diseases like malaria. Many of them were not Christian, and were viewed as readily available. So these all combine to ensure that West Africa is going to be viewed as the preferred labor source. Now again, we see numerous slave trading routes: East Africa, Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, but the bulk, the vast majority, are forcibly transported to the Western Hemisphere. Now, in practice, it's driven by European demand, although Europeans didn't raid Africa for slaves themselves, because the West African societies in which they tried to gain slaves were very good at defending themselves, and many actually sold slaves peacefully. Now, the Europeans traded freely with African merchants and elites. From the capture of prospective slaves to the sale of slaves on the coastal areas, trade was in African hands, and Europeans would wait on the coast because once they entered the interior, they lacked immunities to tropical diseases and they would die en masse. Now, this was all part of what was called the triangular trade, where African kingdoms and societies would receive trade goods in return, like metal goods, tobacco, alcohol, often purchased with American silver. So we see silver tying back into this. European traders interacted as equals with the local Africans, and there is an account of a British agent who spoke improperly to the king of a small state in Gambia. He was beaten and held for ransom. And with Portuguese followed by rivals, they were really the first Europeans to exploit this system. From 1450 to 1600, fewer than 4,000 slaves were shipped annually. And it was very similar to the volume that was seen in the Indian Ocean basin. And the Portuguese are middlemen, because they're also mainly interested in gold and spices. In the 1600s or in the 17th century, that average jumps to 10,000 per year. And it's not just the Portuguese. The British, the Dutch, and the French all get involved to contest the Portuguese monopoly. Now, geographically, most of the African labor were from West or South Central Africa, and they were mostly people from marginal groups like prisoners of war or debtors or criminals. Africans generally did not sell their own peoples. So in terms of capturing potential slaves, the tendency is to start on the coast and then focus more on the interior as demand increased. So Europeans really take advantage of the fact that there's intense competition between kingdoms and tribes. And those who often sold to Europeans did so for short-term economic gain. And as we saw in the map, the vast majority of slaves ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean. Much smaller numbers went to North America, mainland Spanish America, or in Europe. About 15% of those who were enslaved died during what was called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage was the longest leg of the journey from West Africa to the Caribbean, where sometimes the winds would fail and you could be stranded and your ship would simply be adrift. So again, this is a harrowing journey. You can see from the depiction that it is not comfortable. About 10% of the voyages experienced some form of major rebellion, and resistance continued in the Americas, ranging from slow work to outright rebellion. Maroon societies were free communities of former slaves and were more common in the remote regions of South America and the Caribbean. Escaped slaves often mixed with Native Americans within these maroon societies, and Palmares in Brazil was the largest. We know that there were 10,000, at least 10,000 people in this community, and it included escaped slaves, Native Americans, mestizos, and some whites. the fear of slave revolts was always there. Although large-scale revolts were they were rare, and even the small ones were brutally put down. However, the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s finally brought lasting freedom to at least some slaves. So numerous forms of resistance coalesced to try and counter this system. Now again, normally when transatlantic slavery is discussed, it's all about the Western Hemisphere. But what happened back in Africa? What was the fallout of this? Obviously, this will slow the population growth, while Europe and China will expand in population due to the Columbian Exchange. In 1600, sub-Saharan Africa had about 18% of the world's population, but by 1900, it was down to 6%. The slave trade generated economic stagnation and political disruption in Africa, and those who profited from the trade did not invest in production. They're not investing in breakthroughs in agriculture or industry. And since Europeans didn't really increase demand for Africa's products, just for his people, Africa won't benefit. And due to the Columbian Exchange, maize and cassava will help with diets, but the demand is for people, not products. Now, the slave trade did foster moral corruption because judicial decisions are designed to generate victims for the slave trade. Unbalanced gender ratios developed in Africa because, there's more of a demand for male labor. So it substantially increased the labor demands on women in Africa. And fewer men will lead to more polygamous households, which will lead to the increased use of female slaves in West Africa. Female slaves will provide the labor force for plantations that are in West Africa itself, and they'll benefit the urban elite. There were a few women who benefited by marrying European merchants, and some operated their own trading empires. Interestingly enough, women did participate in several state-building enterprises. The kingdom of Dahomey, so it's pronounced Dahomey, was ruled over by a queen mother who required all families to send a daughter to court. In the kingdom of the Congo, women held lower administrative positions and they served on the monarch's council of advisors. And Matamba also had female rulers like Queen Nzinga, who actually resisted Portuguese imperialism. So women are afforded at least some opportunities in Africa throughout this process. Ultimately, the exact effects are going to vary from place to place. Many small-scale kinship-based societies are thoroughly disrupted, and some larger kingdoms, like Congo and Oyo, will slowly disintegrate because access to firearms gained in trade will lead to efforts by outlying regions to become independent. Benin, in the forested area of present-day Nigeria, did succeed in limiting the effects of the slave trade until the 1700s because it diversified its exports and bought firearms and other goods. Benin also banned the export of male slaves, and only with decline in the 1700s did they re-engage in the slave trade. Dahomey actively participated in the slave trade during the early 1700s, but under royal control. Annual raids by the army and the government proved that they depended on the slave trade for revenue. And finally, one of the more chilling effects. In southern Ghana, it was said that there was no rest in the land, and people never went out alone. When European ships appeared on the horizon, mothers often kept their children inside. So again, we see the journey, we see what was perceived as the rationale for it, but we also see the effects that this will have on the populace of the African continent.